The rabies has already entered the boy's bloodstream. 9-year-old Joseph Meister lies in a hospital bed in Paris, July 1885, bitten 14 times by a mad dog 2 days ago. The wounds on his hands and legs are raw and infected. His mother watches him sleep, knowing that in a matter of weeks, perhaps days, the virus will reach his brain. Then will come the symptoms: fever, confusion, hydrophobia, violent spasms, then madness, then death. There is no cure for rabies. There has never been a cure. The boy's breathing is shallow, irregular. In the dim light of the hospital room, his mother, Jean Meister, sits rigid in a wooden chair that seems to press into her spine with each passing hour. She has not slept since the attack. She watches her son's chest rise and fall, counting each breath, as if by counting she can keep him tethered to life. The bandages wrapped around his hands are already stained through, yellow and red, the colors of infection and desperation. Outside the window, Paris continues its indifferent summer routine. Carriages clatter over cobblestones, vendors call out their wares. Somewhere, children are playing, their laughter drifting up from the street below. Jeanne hears none of it. Her world has contracted to this room, this bed, this child whose fate is already written in medical textbooks she cannot read. She remembers the moment she knew. The dog had belonged to a neighbor, a usually docile animal that had suddenly turned savage, frothing at the mouth, attacking Joseph as he walked to school. Other men had beaten it back, killed it. But not before it had bitten her son 14 times, 14 separate wounds where the virus entered his bloodstream. The local doctor in Alsace had been honest, brutally so. "The boy will die," he said. "It may take 4 weeks, it may take 8, but he will die unless—" And here he paused, uncertain whether to offer hope that might prove false. "Unless you take him to Paris, to Louis Pasteur. I have heard he is working on a treatment." A treatment, not a cure, not even a proven therapy. A treatment, experimental, untested, on humans. But it was something. It was more than watching Joseph die in their village home, thrashing and screaming as the virus consumed his brain. So she had brought him here, to this hospital room in Paris, to wait for a man she had never met to decide whether her son would be his experiment. In a laboratory across the city, Louis Pasteur paces. He is 62 years old, partially paralyzed from a stroke 17 years ago, dragging his left leg as he moves. On his laboratory bench sits a series of glass vials containing dried spinal cord tissue from rabbits infected with rabies. The tissue has been attenuated, weakened, through a process he has spent years developing. He has tested it on dogs. 50 dogs, most survived. But a dog is not a child. A laboratory is not a life. The morning sun streams through the tall windows of his laboratory at the École Normale Supérieure, illuminating dust particles suspended in the air, tiny worlds invisible to the naked eye, yet Pasteur knows they are there. His entire career has been built on seeing what others could not see, believing in the invisible, proving that the microscopic world governed the macroscopic one. But this morning, the familiar comfort of his laboratory feels oppressive. The glass vials arranged so carefully on his bench seem to mock him with their measured precision. 14 days of drying. 12 days, 10 days, 8, 6, 4, 2, 1 day. Each vial represents a different level of viral potency, a calculated gradient from nearly harmless to potentially lethal. He has tested this protocol on dogs, watching as their immune systems learn to fight the rabies virus, building immunity through graduated exposure. 50 dogs. He forces himself to remember each one. The successes crowd his memory. Dogs that received the vaccine series were then exposed to virulent rabies and survived. Healthy, active, showing no signs of disease. But there were others. 7 dogs died despite vaccination, 3 from rabies that the vaccine failed to prevent, 4 from complications he still does not fully understand, perhaps the vaccine itself, perhaps contamination, perhaps factors he has not yet identified, an 86% success rate. In laboratory terms, it is remarkable. In human terms, when the human is a 9-year-old boy, it is terrifying. Pasteur is not a medical doctor. He has never treated a patient. If he gives Joseph Meister these injections and the boy dies, he could face prosecution for practicing medicine without a license, perhaps for manslaughter, but if he does nothing, the boy will certainly die, and if the vaccine works, if it actually works on a human being, it will prove that diseases can be prevented, that the invisible world of microorganisms can be controlled, that medicine can move from simply observing death to actively preventing it. He pauses in his pacing, his left leg dragging slightly, a constant reminder of his own mortality. His reflection catches in the glass of a cabinet an older man, white-bearded, left side of his face slightly drooping from the stroke, eyes intense but tired. When did he become this person? The young chemist who separated crystals with tweezers has become an old man who must decide whether to inject a child with a virus that might kill him. The door to the laboratory opens. It is Émile Roux, his closest collaborator, a physician unlike Pasteur. Roux is younger, 32, with the kind of effortless competence that Pasteur both admires and slightly resents. Roux has been with him through the anthrax work, through the early rabies experiments. He knows the data as well as Pasteur does. The boy's mother is asking when you will see them, Roux says quietly. Pasteur does not turn from the window. What would you do? Roux considers this carefully. Their relationship is complex. Roux respects Pasteur's genius, but has learned to be cautious with his own opinions. Pasteur does not always welcome disagreement. The boy is already condemned, Roux says, finally. Without treatment, he will die. The vaccine offers a chance. A significant chance based on the dog trials. 86%, Pasteur says. Which means 14% failure, Roux replies. But 100% failure without intervention. If he dies, they will say we killed him. If he lives, we will have changed medicine forever. Pasteur turns from the window. His eyes are red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He has been awake most of the night, reviewing his notebooks, recalculating, questioning. I am not God, he says quietly. I am a chemist who looks at crystals and microorganisms. What right do I have to make this decision? Roux meets his gaze steadily. The right of knowledge, he says. You know more about rabies than any person alive. The mother brought her son to you because you are the only chance he has. That gives you not just the right, but the obligation to act. Pasteur is silent for a long moment. Then he nods, a small, decisive movement. Prepare the first injection, he says. The 14-day preparation. We begin this afternoon. He makes the decision. The first injection will be administered today. Before we continue with what happened to Joseph Meister and how Pasteur arrived at this moment, I want to ask you something. If you're finding this story compelling, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support genuinely helps me continue creating these long-form documentaries. And I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop a comment and let me know. Now, to understand how Pasteur came to make that terrible decision in 1885, we must go back to the beginning, back to a small town in eastern France, where nobody expected greatness from a tanner's son. Louis Pasteur was born on December 27, 1822, in Dole, a provincial town in the Jura region of France. His father, Jean-Joseph Pasteur, worked with animal hides, transforming raw skins into leather through labor that was physically brutal and socially marginal. Tanners worked with blood and flesh and chemical baths that burned the hands and filled the air with stench. It was necessary work. It was not respected work. The tannery occupied the ground floor of their home on the Rue des Tanneurs, Tanners Street, a narrow lane where the smell of lime and urine and decay hung permanently in the air. The chemical process of tanning required soaking hides in solutions that included dog feces, pigeon droppings, and fermented bran. The smell penetrated everything: clothes, furniture, skin, hair. It marked the Pasteur family as clearly as if they wore signs announcing their occupation. Young Louis grew up with this smell as the constant background of his life. He watched his father work, saw the physical toll the labor took: hands permanently stained and cracked, back bent from lifting and stretching hides, eyes watering from the chemical fumes. The tannery was a place of transformation, though at the time Louis would not have articulated it that way. Raw flesh became useful material through careful application of process and patience. The metaphor would prove prophetic. But Jean-Joseph Pasteur carried something else besides the smell of the tannery. He had been a sergeant in Napoleon's army, had fought in the Peninsular War, had received the Legion of Honor. When Napoleon fell and the monarchy returned, Jean-Joseph returned to Arbois, the town where his family had lived for generations, and resumed the tanner's trade. He married Jeanne-Etiennette Roqui, daughter of a gardener, and they had 4 children, 3 daughters and 1 son. Louis was the 3rd child, the only boy to survive infancy. In the evenings, after the work in the tannery was finished, Jean-Joseph would sometimes speak of his military service. Not often. The memories were complex, mixed with pride and bitterness. He had fought for an emperor who had been defeated, for an empire that no longer existed. But those years had shown him a world beyond Arbois, had given him a glimpse of what men could become through discipline and dedication. He would look at his son and see possibility. Not the life of a tanner, Jean-Joseph wanted something different for Louis, though he was not entirely sure what that something might be. Education, respectability, advancement. The specific shape was unclear, but the direction was certain: upward. The family that raised Louis Pasteur was not poor, but neither were they comfortable. They lived above the tannery. The smell was constant. The social position was fixed. In the rigid hierarchies of provincial France, a tanner's son had clear prospects: learn the trade, inherit the business, marry within the appropriate class, produce children who would continue the cycle. Education beyond basic literacy was not expected. Yet something in Louis Pasteur resisted this trajectory from early childhood. His sisters later recalled that he was obsessive about his schoolwork, methodical in his habits, and intensely serious. He was not a prodigy. His early academic performance was solid but unremarkable. What distinguished him was not brilliance but focus, an almost frightening capacity for sustained concentration that his father recognized as exceptional. The local schoolmaster, Monsieur Romanet, noticed it too. He wrote to Jean-Joseph suggesting that Louis might benefit from education beyond what the village school could provide. The letter was carefully worded. It acknowledged the family's limited means while suggesting that Louis's potential should not be wasted. Jean-Joseph kept that letter folded in his pocket, reading it repeatedly over several weeks as he tried to decide what to do. The decision was not simple. Sending Louis to secondary school would require money the family could barely afford. It would mean losing his labor at the tannery. Louis was already old enough to help with basic tasks. It would mean raising the family's social aspirations to a level that might prove embarrassing if Louis failed. But it would also mean giving his son a chance at the kind of life Jean-Joseph had glimpsed during his military service, a life of the mind rather than the body, of respect rather than mere utility. In the end, ambition won. Jean-Joseph would send Louis to Paris. At 15, Pasteur was sent to Paris for secondary education. It was 1838, and Paris was the intellectual capital of Europe, a city transforming itself through industrial revolution and political ferment. For a boy from Arbois, the city should have been intoxicating. Instead, it was overwhelming. The boarding school, the Impasse des Feuillantines, was located in the Latin Quarter, surrounded by the chaotic energy of student life and urban commerce. The building itself was imposing, 4 stories of grey stone, narrow windows that seemed designed to keep the city out rather than let light in. Louis arrived in October carrying a small trunk containing his clothes, his books, and a miniature portrait his father had commissioned, a reminder of home. The city was noise. That was Louis's first and most overwhelming impression. In Arbois there had been the sounds of the tannery, the church bells, the occasional market day. But Paris was a constant assault of sound, carriages clattering over cobblestones at all hours, vendors shouting, crowds arguing and laughing, and simply existing in dense, overwhelming proximity. At night, Louis would lie in his narrow bed in the dormitory, surrounded by the breathing and snoring of 20 other boys, and feel the city pressing in on him like a physical weight. He tried to adjust. He attended classes, completed his assignments, spoke when spoken to. But something was breaking inside him. He stopped eating, claiming the food made him ill. He stopped sleeping, lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. During the day, he would find himself drifting during lectures, his mind going blank, unable to process the words being spoken. When called upon to recite, he would stand silent, mouth open, no words coming. His roommates noticed. They were not cruel, but neither were they particularly sympathetic. Homesickness was common enough, especially among provincial boys, but it was expected that one would overcome it through willpower and time. Louis seemed unable or unwilling to do so. He withdrew further, spending his free hours alone in the dormitory, staring at the miniature portrait of his family, touching it like a talisman. Within weeks, Pasteur became desperately homesick. He stopped eating, he stopped sleeping. His father, summoned by the school, found Louis pale and withdrawn, staring at nothing. The headmaster's letter had been tactful but clear. The boy was not adapting, was becoming a concern, needed to return home before the situation worsened. Jean-Joseph made the journey to Paris, a significant expense and disruption, arriving at the school on a cold November morning to find his son transformed, thinner, hollow-eyed, looking younger than his 15 years. "Papa," Louis said when he saw his father, and then could say nothing else, tears streaming down his face. Jean-Joseph brought his son home without recrimination or disappointment. If he felt frustration at the wasted expense and lost opportunity, he did not show it. The journey back to Arbois was quiet, Louis sitting hunched in the coach, watching the landscape gradually transform from urban to rural, from stone to fields, until finally they arrived back at the house on Rue des Tanneurs, and Louis could smell the tannery, that familiar, terrible smell that meant home. This episode reveals something essential about Pasteur's character. He was not naturally cosmopolitan. He was not comfortable with disruption or change. Throughout his life, he would be most productive when anchored to familiar places, familiar routines, familiar people. His genius would emerge not from adventurous exploration, but from disciplined excavation, digging deeper and deeper into single questions until he reached bedrock. Back in Arbois, Pasteur resumed his studies at the local college. He excelled. His teachers noted his talent for drawing. He produced portraits of his family and neighbors with genuine skill. For a time, it seemed he might become an artist. In 1840, at 17, he passed his baccalaureate in letters. 2 years later, he earned his baccalaureate in science. The grade in chemistry, mediocre. The chemistry examination had taken place in a stuffy room in Besançon, the regional capital, on a humid August day. Louis sat among 24 other candidates, working through problems about oxidation and reduction, about the properties of sulfur and phosphorus, about the composition of common acids. He completed the examination feeling uncertain, not because he did not know the material, but because he sensed that his answers lacked something the examiners were looking for. Perhaps flair, perhaps intuition, perhaps simply confidence in his own understanding. When the results arrived several weeks later, the mediocre grade confirmed his suspicion. He had passed, but barely. The examiner's notes, which his teacher shared with him, mentioned adequate knowledge but limited insight into chemical principles. Louis folded the paper carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. He did not show it to his father. This detail matters because of what came after. The boy who received a mediocre grade in chemistry would become one of the most consequential chemists in history. The lesson is not that grades are meaningless, it is that transformation is possible, that foundational interest can emerge later than institutional timelines assume. Pasteur's early academic career was characterized not by precocious brilliance, but by methodical development. He was building the habits that would later allow him to do extraordinary work: precision, patience, repetition, resistance to distraction. In 1843, Pasteur was admitted to the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, the elite institution that trained France's future professors. This time he did not flee home. He was 20 years old, more mature, more certain of his purpose. At the École Normale, he studied under Jean-Baptiste Dumas, the famous chemist whose lectures were so popular that people crowded the aisles to hear him speak. Dumas demonstrated that chemistry was not merely descriptive, it was explanatory. It revealed the underlying structure of matter. It could transform industries. It could change the world. Dumas would arrive for his lectures dressed impeccably, his presentation as polished as his demonstrations. He did not simply explain chemical reactions, he performed them, transforming substances before the students' eyes while narrating the invisible processes that drove the visible changes. Louis sat in the front row of the lecture hall, notebook open, transcribing not just the words, but trying to capture the underlying logic, the way Dumas thought about matter and transformation. After one particularly brilliant lecture on organic compounds, Louis approached Dumas during the question period. "Sir," he said, voice uncertain but determined, "you said that the arrangement of atoms determines the properties of compounds. But how do we discover that arrangement if we cannot see atoms?" Dumas regarded him with interest. It was a good question, revealing genuine engagement rather than mere memorization. "We infer structure from behavior," he replied. "We observe what a compound does, how it reacts, what light it absorbs, what crystals it forms, and from those observations we deduce the underlying architecture." It is detective work, Monsieur Pasteur. We are solving mysteries left by nature. With a conversation planted a seed. Chemistry as detective work. Structure revealed through behavior. The invisible made visible through careful observation and logical inference. These ideas would guide Pasteur's research for the next 4 decades. Pasteur absorbed this vision completely. He began conducting his own research under the supervision of Antoine Jérôme Balard, investigating the crystalline structure of various compounds. In 1847, at 24, he earned his doctorate in physics and chemistry. His dissertation was competent. Nothing about it suggested he would revolutionize science. He accepted a position teaching physics at a lycée in Dijon. Then, in 1848, something happened. Pasteur was investigating tartaric acid, a compound found in wine sediment. Chemists had long known that tartaric acid existed in 2 forms that were chemically identical but behaved differently when polarized light passed through them. One form rotated light to the right, the other to the left. Why? It was a minor puzzle, the kind of question that most scientists would note with interest and then move past. But Pasteur became obsessed with it. There had to be a reason for the difference. Chemical composition could not be the answer. Both forms had identical chemical formulas. Therefore, the answer must lie in structure, in the 3-dimensional arrangement of atoms within the molecule. Working alone in his laboratory, Pasteur crystallized both forms of the compound and examined them under a microscope. The work was tedious, preparing pure solutions, waiting for crystals to form, examining each crystal individually under magnification. He filled notebook after notebook with sketches of crystal shapes, trying to identify patterns. Then, one morning in late spring, he saw it. The crystals were not identical. They were mirror images, asymmetric in opposite directions. It was as if someone had taken a single crystal shape and created its reflection, reversing its handedness. Pasteur's heart began racing. He looked again, certain he must be mistaken. But no, the asymmetry was unmistakable. Left-handed crystals and right-handed crystals mixed together in the same batch, using tweezers and extraordinary patience, working for hours with breaks only when his eyes grew too strained to continue. Pasteur separated the crystals by hand, sorting them into two piles based on their shapes. The physical work was painstaking. Each crystal was tiny, irregular, easily broken. His hands cramped, his eyes watered. But he continued, driven by the conviction that he was seeing something no one had seen before, understanding something fundamental about matter itself. Once sorted, he dissolved each type separately and tested the resulting solutions with polarized light. The right-handed crystals produced a solution that rotated light to the right. The left-handed crystals rotated light to the left. The connection between crystal structure and optical behavior was perfect, unmistakable. Pasteur stood in his laboratory holding two vials of chemically identical solutions that behaved differently because of molecular architecture. He was 25 years old. He had just discovered molecular chirality, the handedness of molecules, though that term would not be coined for decades. This discovery, molecular chirality, the handedness of molecules, opened an entirely new field of chemistry. It demonstrated that the three-dimensional structure of molecules determined their properties. It suggested that living organisms might produce only one form of a chiral compound, while non-living processes produced both. It hinted at a fundamental difference between the chemistry of life and the chemistry of inanimate matter. Pasteur announced his discovery to the French Academy of Sciences. The response was immediate recognition. Jean-Baptiste Dumas verified the work personally. At 25, Pasteur was suddenly a figure of scientific importance. He was appointed professor of chemistry at the University of Strasbourg. In Strasbourg, Pasteur met Marie Laurent, daughter of the university rector. Within 2 months of meeting her, he wrote to her father requesting permission to marry her, describing his limited financial prospects with painful honesty, but also his determination to succeed through work and studious habits. The letter was awkward and earnest. The letter, which survived in the Laurent family archives, reveals Pasteur's characteristic intensity applied to personal life. Monsieur le Recteur, an offer of my hand to your daughter may seem precipitous, as we have known each other for so short a time. I recognize that my material prospects are limited. My position at the university provides a modest income, sufficient for basic necessities, but hardly comfortable. I have no family wealth, no expectations of inheritance. My father is a tanner in Arbois, an honest tradesman, but not a man of means. What I can offer is dedication to my work and to the woman who would choose to share my life. I am absorbed by scientific research, a calling that demands long hours and offers uncertain rewards. I will not deceive you. I am not a man who will provide entertainment or social prominence, but I am reliable, I am faithful, and I believe my work has significance beyond my own ambitions. Your daughter has shown kindness in our conversations. I believe we share certain values regarding the importance of discipline and purpose. If you would consent to my addressing her directly on the subject of marriage, I would be honored. Your servant, Louis Pasteur. The letter was awkward and earnest. Marie's father approved. They married in 1849. The wedding was a small affair in the university chapel. Marie wore a simple dress. The family's resources did not extend to elaborate celebration. Louis wore his best suit, slightly too large in the shoulders, borrowed from a colleague. During the ceremony, Marie would later recall, Louis seemed almost surprised to find himself there, as if marriage were a chemical reaction that had proceeded more quickly than expected. Marie-Laurent Pasteur would become the essential support structure of Louis Pasteur's life. She copied his manuscripts, managed their household, raised their children, and endured his long absences and obsessive work habits without complaint. The marriage was not romantic in the modern sense. Pasteur's letters to Marie are formal, rarely expressing emotion, but it was profoundly functional. Marie understood that she had married a man whose first commitment was to his work, and she organized her life around enabling that work. In the evenings, when Louis worked late in his laboratory, Marie would bring him dinner on a tray, simple meals that could be eaten without interrupting his observations or calculations. She learned to recognize his moods, knew when to speak and when silence was required. She became fluent in his scientific language not because she had formal education in chemistry, but because she listened year after year as he explained his work, used her as a sounding board for ideas still forming. Their correspondence from periods when Louis traveled reveals the nature of their relationship. His letters report on experiments and results, rarely mentioning personal feelings or experiences outside his work. Her letters manage household affairs, report on the children's health and education, and always include reminders to rest, to eat properly, to take care of himself. The asymmetry is striking and poignant. Between 1850 and 1865, Marie gave birth to 5 children: Jean, Jean-Baptiste, Cécile, Marie-Louise, and Camille. Only 2 would survive to adulthood. In 1854, Pasteur was appointed Dean of the Faculty of Sciences at the University of Lille, an industrial city in northern France where the economy depended on brewing and distillation. Almost immediately, a local distiller named Bigot approached him with a problem. His beet juice fermentation kept going sour, producing acid instead of alcohol. Spoiled batches were destroying his business. Could science explain why? Pasteur agreed to investigate, viewing it as an opportunity to apply scientific principles to practical industrial problems. He traveled to Bigot's distillery, a large facility on the outskirts of Lille where massive vats of beet juice fermented in warm, humid rooms that smelled of yeast and sugar, and something slightly wrong, the sour smell of batches going bad. Bigot was a practical man, impatient with theory, desperate for solutions. "I don't need to understand why," he told Pasteur during their first meeting. "I need to know what to do, how to prevent this. My business is failing." Pasteur nodded. "To know what to do, you must understand why. They are inseparable." He took samples from both healthy and soured batches, returning to his laboratory to examine them. Pasteur examined the fermentation tanks under a microscope. In healthy fermentation, he found yeast cells, round, budding, organized. In the soured batches, he found different organisms, rod-shaped bacteria. This suggested something radical, that fermentation was not a purely chemical process, as chemists believed, but a biological one caused by living microorganisms. When the right organism was present, you got alcohol. When the wrong organism contaminated the batch, you got acid. The implication struck him immediately. If fermentation was a biological process, then controlling it meant controlling the microorganisms involved. Cleanliness would matter, temperature would matter, the source of the yeast would matter. Everything about the industrial process would need to be reconsidered through a biological lens. He returned to the distillery with recommendations: stricter sanitation, heat treatment of equipment, careful selection, and cultivation of yeast cultures. Bigot was skeptical but desperate enough to try. Within months, the failure rate of fermentations dropped dramatically. Word spread among the industrialists of Lille. Pasteur's methods worked. This observation would eventually lead Pasteur to the germ theory of disease, but first it led him to a bitter scientific war over the nature of life itself. The dominant theory of the time held that living organisms could arise spontaneously from non-living matter under the right conditions. Rotting meat produced maggots. Stagnant water produced algae. Fermentation produced yeast. These were not infections from outside. They were spontaneous generation, life emerging from chemistry. Félix Archimède Pouchet, a respected naturalist from Rouen, was the leading defender of spontaneous generation in France. In 1858, he published experiments claiming to demonstrate that microorganisms appeared in sterile organic matter without external contamination. Pasteur believed this was wrong. If fermentation required specific living organisms, then those organisms had to come from somewhere. They did not appear spontaneously. They were present in the air, in dust, on surfaces. Contamination was the source, not creation. To prove this, Pasteur designed one of the most famous experiments in the history of science. He created glass flasks with long, curved necks, swan neck flasks. He filled them with nutrient broth, then boiled the broth to kill any organisms present. The curved neck allowed air to enter the flask but trapped dust and microorganisms in the bend. The broth remained sterile indefinitely. But if he broke the neck, allowing dust to settle directly into the broth, microorganisms appeared within days. The elegance of the experiment lay in its simplicity. It refuted the objection that heating or sealing prevented spontaneous generation by somehow destroying a vital force. The flasks were open to air. No vital force was excluded, but they remained sterile because microorganisms could not reach the broth. Life came only from life. Pasteur demonstrated the experiment publicly at the Sorbonne. In 1864, the lecture hall was packed. Scientists, students, journalists, even members of the general public, curious about the controversy. He stood at the front of the amphitheatre, a row of swan neck flasks arranged on the demonstration bench, and explained his reasoning with clarity and force. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying through the hall, "the question before us is fundamental to our understanding of life itself. Does life arise from non-living matter, or does life come only from preceding life? The answer has profound implications, not merely for science, but for philosophy, for medicine, for our conception of humanity's place in nature." He held up one of the flasks. "This vessel contains nutrient broth, boiled to kill all organisms. The neck is open to air. No seal prevents the entry of whatever forces or vapors might be imagined to cause spontaneous generation. Yet observe, the broth remains clear, sterile. No microorganisms appear. Why? Because microorganisms cannot fly. They are carried by dust particles which settle in the curve of the neck, unable to reach the broth." He then took another flask and, with theatrical precision, broke the neck with a sharp tap. Now, with the neck broken, dust can fall directly into the broth. We will set this aside and observe what happens in the coming days. Life will appear, not spontaneously, but through contamination from the air. The demonstration was convincing, but the debate with Pouchet continued for years, growing increasingly bitter. The implication was profound. Life came only from life. Microorganisms did not spontaneously generate, they reproduced. And if this was true for fermentation, might it also be true for disease? The debate between Pasteur and Pouchet became increasingly vicious. They conducted dueling experiments before the Academy of Sciences. Pasteur accused Pouchet of sloppy methodology. Pouchet accused Pasteur of metaphysical bias, of wanting to believe in a designed universe where life could not emerge from non-life. The accusations were not entirely unfair. Pasteur was a devout Catholic who saw no conflict between science and faith. His belief that life came only from life aligned with his religious convictions, but his experiments also worked. Pouchet's did not. By 1864, Pasteur had essentially won the debate. The Academy of Sciences accepted his position. Spontaneous generation was dead. But during this same period, Pasteur's personal life was beginning to fracture under a weight he could not prevent or control. In September 1859, 9-year-old Jeanne Pasteur, the eldest daughter, died of typhoid fever. The disease came suddenly: fever, abdominal pain, delirium. Within 2 weeks, she was dead. Jeanne had been the bright one, the talkative one, the child who asked endless questions and remembered everything. She had her father's intensity without his introversion, her mother's patience without her resignation. She drew pictures and left them around the house for her parents to find: flowers, birds, fanciful creatures that existed only in her imagination. The illness began with a simple complaint. She was tired, her stomach hurt. Marie put her to bed with warm compresses, expecting the discomfort to pass. But by evening, Jeanne's fever had spiked. By the next morning, she was delirious, speaking to people who were not there, crying out in distress at hallucinations only she could see. The doctor came, examined her, and gave the diagnosis that every parent dreaded: typhoid fever. "Keep her comfortable," he said, which was medical code for "there is nothing to be done but wait for death." Louis Pasteur, who could observe microorganisms under a microscope and design experiments to prove that invisible organisms cause fermentation, could do nothing to save his own child. Medicine had no treatment for typhoid. It could name the disease. It could describe the progression of symptoms. It could predict death. It could not prevent it. He sat by Jeanne's bedside during those 2 weeks, watching her waste away, watching the disease consume her. He held her hand as she thrashed in fever dreams. He wiped her face with cool cloths that provided momentary comfort, but no cure. And he understood with a clarity that was almost unbearable that knowledge without application was torture. He knew microorganisms caused disease. He could see them under a microscope, but he could not stop them from killing his daughter. Jeanne died on a Tuesday morning, early, as dawn light was just beginning to filter through the bedroom curtains. She had been unconscious for 18 hours. At the end, her breathing simply stopped. No final dramatic moment, just a cessation. Marie was holding one hand, Louis the other. They sat in silence for a long time after, neither moving, as if by remaining still they could postpone the moment when they would have to release her hands and admit she was gone. 6 years later, in 1865, 2-year-old Camille died. The following year, 12-year-old Cécile died, also of typhoid. 3 daughters lost in 7 years. Only Jean-Baptiste and Marie-Louise survived. Pasteur rarely spoke about these deaths publicly. His letters from the period are brief and controlled. But those who knew him reported a change. He had always been intense and driven. After his daughters died, he became relentless. He worked longer hours. He drove his assistants harder. He seemed to be in a race against something. Émile Roux later wrote about this period. After the deaths of his children, Pasteur worked with a fury that was almost frightening. He would arrive at the laboratory before dawn and remain until late at night. He ate little, slept less. When experiments failed, he would become enraged, shouting at assistants, throwing equipment. Then he would apologize, quietly and formally, and return to work. It was as if he were trying to outrun grief through productivity, to make so many discoveries that the loss of his children would be balanced by the lives saved through his research. Of course, no such balance is possible, but he tried nonetheless. The question of how much these personal tragedies motivated Pasteur's later work on infectious disease is difficult to answer with certainty. He never explicitly connected them, but the timing is suggestive. Before 1859, Pasteur worked primarily on crystallography and fermentation, important work but abstract, industrial. After 1865, he increasingly focused on diseases: silkworm disease, anthrax, cholera, rabies. The shift from studying how yeast makes beer to studying how bacteria kill children is not a natural progression of interests. It is the work of a man who has watched death and decided to fight it. In 1865, the French government asked Pasteur to investigate a catastrophic disease destroying the country's silkworm industry. Silkworms were dying by the millions, their bodies covered with dark spots, pébrine. The silk industry, crucial to France's economy, was collapsing. Pasteur knew nothing about silkworms. He knew nothing about insects. When he received the government's request, his first response was to refuse. "I have never even seen a silkworm," he wrote to the Minister of Agriculture. "I cannot help you." The government persisted. The silk industry employed tens of thousands of workers, primarily in southern France. Its collapse would mean economic catastrophe. Pasteur was France's leading expert on microorganisms and disease. If anyone could solve this problem, it would be him. Reluctantly, Pasteur agreed. But he approached the problem with his usual method: observation, experimentation, isolation of variables. He traveled to the silkworm-growing regions of southern France with his family, setting up a laboratory in a farmhouse in Alès, a town in the Cévennes mountains where silk production had once been the primary industry. The farmhouse was rustic, far from the comfortable surroundings of Paris. The laboratory was a converted barn, hot in summer, cold in winter, infested with mice that occasionally contaminated experiments, but it was isolated, which meant fewer distractions, and it was surrounded by silkworm farms, which meant abundant access to both healthy and diseased specimens. For 5 years, Pasteur and his family lived in this farmhouse for months at a time. Marie managed the household and assisted with record-keeping. Jean-Baptiste, then a teenager, helped collect specimens. Even Marie-Louise, the surviving daughter, learned to recognize diseased silkworms under a microscope. The work was tedious and often heartbreaking. Pasteur would examine hundreds of silkworms daily, studying infected silkworms under the microscope, trying to identify the cause. He filled notebooks with sketches of parasites and bacteria, trying to distinguish patterns from noise, signal from randomness. He found 2 different diseases affecting the worms. One was pébrine, caused by a parasite that infected the silkworm's entire body, visible as dark spots on the skin and throughout the internal tissues. The other was flacherie, caused by bacteria in the digestive system that made the worms lethargic and unable to pupate. The 2 diseases often occurred together, which had confused previous researchers into thinking they were observing a single disease with variable symptoms. The key insight was that both diseases could be prevented by careful selection of eggs from healthy moths. If farmers examined moths under microscopes before breeding them, discarding any that showed signs of infection, the disease could be controlled. The parasite and bacteria were transmitted from parent to progeny through the eggs. Breaking that chain of transmission would save the industry. It was a simple solution in principle, but difficult in practice. It required farmers to adopt new techniques, to invest in microscopes, to learn skills that had never been part of traditional silk production. The silk industry resisted. Farmers found the microscope technique difficult and time-consuming. Many dismissed Pasteur's methods as theoretical nonsense from a Parisian scientist who did not understand practical agriculture. But gradually, as Pasteur's method proved effective, it was adopted. Farms that followed his protocols saw dramatic reductions in silkworm mortality. Farms that ignored them continued to suffer losses. The economic incentive overcame cultural resistance. The French silk industry recovered. Pasteur had demonstrated that understanding the microbial cause of disease allowed for practical prevention. But the work nearly killed him. In October 1868, while still working on the silkworm problem, Pasteur suffered a massive stroke. He was 45 years old. The stroke paralyzed the left side of his body. For weeks he could not speak coherently. His doctors expected him to die. The stroke occurred in the morning without warning. Pasteur had been working at his desk, writing notes on a recent experiment, when suddenly his left arm went numb. He tried to stand and found he could not control his left leg. He attempted to call for Marie, but the words that came out were garbled, incomprehensible, even to himself. Marie found him minutes later, collapsed in his chair, the left side of his face drooping, eyes wide with fear and confusion. She sent immediately for the doctor, who arrived within the hour and confirmed the diagnosis: a cerebral hemorrhage, severe, likely fatal. For 3 days, Pasteur drifted in and out of consciousness. When awake, he could not speak coherently or move his left side. Marie sat by his bedside as she had sat by her daughter's bedsides, watching and waiting to see if death would take another member of her family. But Pasteur did not die. On the 4th day, he woke more clearly, tried to speak, and managed a single word: work. His recovery was slow and incomplete. He learned to walk again, dragging his left leg, using a cane for support. His left arm remained largely useless, hanging stiffly at his side. Speech returned gradually, though he sometimes struggled to find words, his fluency permanently damaged. But his mind remained sharp. If anything, the stroke seemed to intensify his focus, as if the brush with death had clarified what mattered. He returned to work within months, continuing the silkworm research and already thinking ahead to new problems, new diseases to investigate. He did not die. Slowly, painfully, he recovered partial movement and speech, but for the rest of his life, 27 more years, he dragged his left leg and his left arm hung stiffly. The stroke slowed him physically but seemed to intensify his mental focus. If anything, he worked harder after the stroke than before, as if aware that time was now limited and much remained to be done. In 1873, the French Academy of Medicine elected Pasteur as a member, despite the fact that he was not a physician. The election was controversial. Many physicians resented the intrusion of a chemist into medicine. They had studied anatomy, dissection, bedside diagnosis. What could a man who looked at crystals and fermentation tell them about treating patients? But Pasteur was increasingly convinced that medicine was asking the wrong questions. Physicians studied symptoms and tried to classify diseases based on those symptoms. Pasteur believed that diseases should be classified by their causes, the specific microorganisms that produce them. If you could identify the cause, you might be able to prevent or cure the disease rather than merely describing it as it killed the patient. This conviction led him to one of the most important discoveries in medical history, but it began with chickens. In 1879, Pasteur was investigating chicken cholera, a disease that killed poultry across France. He had isolated the bacterium that caused the disease and was growing it in culture. During a summer break, a culture was accidentally left on the laboratory bench for several weeks. When his assistant, Charles Chamberlain, returned and injected this old culture into chickens, the chickens became mildly ill but recovered. When they were later exposed to fresh, virulent cholera bacteria, they did not become sick. The old culture had weakened, attenuated, and exposure to the weakened bacteria had protected the chickens against the disease. This was vaccination, the principle Edward Jenner had discovered for smallpox in 1796, but Pasteur had found a general method. You could weaken a pathogen and use it to stimulate immunity. The discovery was accidental, but Pasteur's recognition of its significance was not. Many scientists would have dismissed the survival of the chickens as experimental error, contaminated cultures, or random variation. Pasteur saw it as a principle that could be generalized. If time and exposure to oxygen weaken chicken cholera bacteria, what other methods might weaken other pathogens? Heat, chemical treatment, passage through different animal species. The possibilities were vast. Pasteur immediately recognized the implications. If this principle worked for chicken cholera, it might work for other diseases, anthrax, rabies, perhaps even human diseases like typhoid and cholera. He began working on anthrax, a bacterial disease that killed sheep and cattle across Europe, and occasionally humans. Robert Koch, a German physician, had already identified the anthrax bacterium and demonstrated that it formed spores capable of surviving in soil for years. But Koch had not developed a vaccine. The rivalry between Pasteur and Koch was professional but intense, sharpened by national pride and personal temperament. Koch was younger by 19 years, methodical, less inclined toward dramatic public demonstrations. He worked in relative obscurity in provincial German towns before gaining recognition for his work on anthrax and tuberculosis. Where Pasteur was theatrical and combative, Koch was quiet and systematic. Where Pasteur made intuitive leaps, Koch built comprehensive proofs through painstaking documentation. But both men had egos proportional to their abilities, and neither was inclined to share credit or acknowledge the other's contributions graciously. Koch had criticized Pasteur's work on fermentation in an 1881 paper, suggesting that some of Pasteur's conclusions were overstated and that his experimental methods lacked the rigor necessary for definitive proof. The criticism was not entirely unfair. Pasteur's approach was sometimes more suggestive than definitive, relying on plausibility and partial evidence where Koch would have demanded comprehensive demonstration. Pasteur had returned the criticism with interest, dismissing Koch's work as mere confirmation of principles Pasteur had already established. In a letter to a colleague, Pasteur wrote, "Koch's so-called discoveries on anthrax simply elaborate on work I published years ago. He contributes technical refinements but no fundamental insights." This was also unfair. Koch had made genuine contributions, particularly in developing culture techniques and in identifying the tuberculosis bacterium, work that would earn him the Nobel Prize in 1905. The scientific disagreements became entangled with national hostilities. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 had left France humiliated and bitter. Alsace-Lorraine, the region where Joseph Meister was from, had been ceded to Germany. Pasteur's decision to return his honorary degree from the University of Bonn was both a personal protest and a symbolic gesture for a wounded nation. Koch, a German patriot, saw Pasteur's nationalism as tainting his science with politics. The two men never met in person, despite attending some of the same scientific conferences. At the International Congress of Hygiene in Geneva in 1882, both Pasteur and Koch presented papers. They sat in the same hall, listened to each other's presentations, but did not speak. Colleagues who tried to introduce them or facilitate conversation found both men politely but firmly declining. Their rivalry played out in journal publications and at scientific conferences where they were both present but avoided each other. It was a competition between French and German science, between Pasteur's intuitive leaps and Koch's systematic rigor. Both were brilliant. Both were right more often than wrong. Both resented the other's successes. The tension reached its peak in 1882 when Koch published his groundbreaking work on tuberculosis, identifying the bacterium that caused the disease. The discovery was monumental. Tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in Europe, killing 1 in 7 people. Koch's identification of the causative organism opened the possibility of developing treatments and preventive measures. Pasteur, when asked for comment by journalists, offered only grudging acknowledgement. Koch's work on tuberculosis is competent. It confirms the germ theory of disease, which I have long advocated. He did not mention that Koch's methods for isolating and culturing bacteria were more sophisticated than any Pasteur had developed, or that identifying the tuberculosis bacterium was one of the great achievements of 19th century medicine. Koch, in turn, was dismissive of Pasteur's rabies vaccine, suggesting that the treatment was experimental and inadequately tested. In a paper published in 1885, Koch wrote, "The so-called rabies vaccine reported by Pasteur may prove effective, but the evidence presented is anecdotal rather than systematic. A few successful cases do not constitute scientific proof." The criticism stung particularly because it had some merit. Pasteur's rabies work was less rigorously documented than his earlier research, driven by urgency and the pressure to help bite victims who might otherwise die. The rivalry outlasted both men, shaping how their nations remembered them. In France, Pasteur became the symbol of scientific genius and national pride. In Germany, Koch held a similar position. Both deserved the recognition. Both would have accomplished more if they had been able to collaborate rather than compete. But the personal and political barriers between them proved insurmountable. They died, Koch in 1910, Pasteur 15 years earlier in 1895, without ever having reconciled or even spoken directly to one another. Their students would eventually collaborate, and the methods both men developed would merge into the unified field of microbiology. But the founders themselves remained divided by pride, nationalism, and the very competitiveness that had driven their achievements. By 1881, Pasteur believed he had developed an anthrax vaccine. He proposed a public demonstration at Pouilly-le-Fort, a farm near Paris. 50 sheep would be divided into two groups. 25 would receive the vaccine, 25 would receive nothing, then all 50 would be injected with virulent anthrax. The vaccinated sheep would survive, the unvaccinated would die. The proposal was audacious, perhaps recklessly so. Pasteur was staking his reputation on a single demonstration with no room for ambiguity. Either the vaccine worked or it did not. Either the sheep lived or they died. The result would be visible, undeniable, public. The demonstration was scheduled for May 1881. Scientists, veterinarians, farmers, and journalists gathered to watch. Pasteur appeared confident. Privately, he was terrified. The vaccine he had described in public, attenuated by exposure to oxygen, had not worked reliably in preliminary tests. The vaccine he actually used at Pouilly-le-Fort was developed by Chamberlain using a different method, chemical attenuation with potassium bichromate. Pasteur never publicly acknowledged this substitution. He allowed the scientific community to believe the oxygen method had worked. Why the deception? Partly because he wanted credit for the method he had publicly described, partly because admitting the switch would have required admitting uncertainty and risk which would have undermined public confidence, and partly because, in Pasteur's view, the important thing was that vaccination worked. The specific technique mattered less than the principle. On May 5th, the sheep were vaccinated. The first injection was given in a field at Pouilly-le-Fort, with dozens of observers watching as veterinarians moved from sheep to sheep, administering the weakened anthrax culture. The sheep tolerated the injection well, mild symptoms, no deaths. On May 17th, they were revaccinated with a stronger preparation, again mild symptoms, recovery within days. The unvaccinated control group grazed peacefully, unaware of their role in the drama. On May 31st, all 50 sheep were injected with virulent anthrax. This was the test. The bacterium injected was guaranteed fatal to unprotected animals. The question was whether vaccination had provided protection. Pasteur returned to Paris to wait. He could not sleep, could not concentrate on other work. He had taken an enormous gamble. If the vaccinated sheep died, his reputation would be destroyed. His claims about vaccination would be dismissed as fraud or incompetence. The years of work on anthrax would be wasted. Émile Roux stayed at Pouilly-le-Fort to monitor the sheep. He sent daily telegrams to Paris, brief reports on the animals' conditions. By June 1st, the unvaccinated sheep were becoming ill, fever, lethargy, labored breathing. The vaccinated sheep remained healthy. On June 2nd, observers returned to the farm for the final results. Pasteur took the morning train from Paris, accompanied by Marie and several colleagues. He said little during the journey, staring out the window at the countryside passing by, preparing himself for either triumph or catastrophe. 24 of the 25 unvaccinated sheep were dead. The 25th was dying as the observers arrived, lying on its side, breathing shallowly, beyond any hope of recovery. It would be dead within the hour. All 25 vaccinated sheep were healthy, grazing normally, showing no signs of illness. The demonstration was a complete success. The crowd of observers broke into applause. Journalists rushed to send telegrams to their newspapers. Pasteur, standing in the field surrounded by healthy, vaccinated sheep and the corpses of the controls, allowed himself a rare smile. One veterinarian, skeptical before the demonstration, approached Pasteur and shook his hand. "Monsieur," he said, "you have just changed medicine forever." Pasteur became a national hero overnight. Orders for anthrax vaccine poured in from around the world. Within a year, hundreds of thousands of animals had been vaccinated. The economic impact was enormous. Livestock losses from anthrax declined dramatically in regions that adopted vaccination. But the success came with costs. Pasteur's relationship with Charles Chamberlain, whose method had actually been used, became strained. Chamberlain felt that his contribution had been minimized, that Pasteur had taken credit for collaborative work. He continued working in Pasteur's laboratory, but the relationship was never the same. Jean-Joseph Henri Toussaint, a veterinarian who had developed a similar vaccine independently, accused Pasteur of stealing his methods. Pasteur dismissed the accusation publicly, but privately acknowledged in his notebooks that Toussaint's work had influenced his approach. This pattern, claiming credit, minimizing collaborators, refusing to acknowledge rivals, would become increasingly characteristic of Pasteur's later career. He was not a generous scientist. He did not share credit willingly. His laboratory was run autocratically, with assistants expected to follow instructions exactly and not question his methods. Émile Roux, Pasteur's closest collaborator, later wrote about the laboratory culture with ambivalence. Roux admired Pasteur's genius and dedication, but also documented his difficult personality, the outbursts of temper, the refusal to admit error, the tendency to claim sole credit for work that was genuinely collaborative. Roux continued working with Pasteur for decades, but the relationship was complex and sometimes bitter. While the anthrax vaccine was being deployed across Europe, Pasteur began investigating rabies, perhaps the most terrifying disease known to humans. Rabies was rare but absolutely fatal. It was transmitted through the bite of infected animals, usually dogs, sometimes wolves. The virus traveled slowly from the bite wound to the brain, an incubation period that could last weeks or months. During this time, the victim appeared healthy. Then the symptoms began: fever, headache, confusion, then agitation, hallucinations, hydrophobia, the inability to swallow water despite desperate thirst. Then violent spasms, delirium, paralysis, coma, death. The progression was inevitable. There was no cure. There had never been a cure. Pasteur's approach to rabies was methodical but hampered by a fundamental problem. He could not see the virus. The microscopes of the 1880s were not powerful enough to visualize viruses, which are much smaller than bacteria. Pasteur knew the disease was caused by some infectious agent present in the saliva and nervous tissue of rabid animals, but he could not directly observe it. So he worked indirectly. He obtained rabies-infected tissue from dogs and injected it into rabbits, cultivating the virus in a controlled environment. By repeatedly passing the virus through rabbits, serial passage, he found that the virus became more virulent for rabbits but less virulent for dogs. He then took spinal cord tissue from infected rabbits, dried it for varying periods, and tested it on dogs. Tissue dried for 14 days was almost harmless. Tissue dried for only a few days was still potent. By administering a series of injections starting with the weakest tissue and progressing to the strongest, Pasteur found he could immunize dogs against rabies. Of 50 dogs vaccinated and then exposed to rabies, most survived. But a dog is not a human. The rabies virus behaves differently in different species, and the ethical calculation is different. You can experiment on dogs, expose them to rabies deliberately, observe their suffering and death, and learn from it. You cannot do this with humans. Yet humans were dying of rabies. Not many, perhaps a few hundred per year in France, but those who contracted it died horribly. If the vaccine worked in dogs, would it work in humans? There was only one way to find out. This brings us back to July 6, 1885, and 9-year-old Joseph Meister. The boy and his mother travelled to Paris from Alsace on the recommendation of a local doctor who had heard of Pasteur's rabies research. Joseph had been bitten 14 times by a rabid dog. The wounds were severe. The dog's owner had shot it, and the subsequent autopsy confirmed rabies. Without treatment, Joseph would certainly die. Pasteur consulted with 2 physicians, Jacques-Joseph Grancher and Alfred Vulpian. He showed them his data from the dog experiments. He explained the vaccine protocol, a series of 13 injections over 10 days, starting with the weakest virus and progressing to the strongest. The goal was to stimulate immunity faster than the virus could reach the brain. The meeting took place in Pasteur's laboratory on a warm July afternoon. Vulpian examined the data carefully, reading through Pasteur's notebooks, asking questions about methodology and controls. Grancher focused on the practical aspects, how the injections would be administered, how the boy would be monitored, what complications might arise. "The risk is substantial," Vulpian said finally. "We are proposing to inject a child with rabies virus. If the attenuation is insufficient, we may kill him ourselves." Pasteur nodded. "If we do nothing, he dies with certainty. The vaccine offers a chance." "How good a chance?" Grancher asked. "Your dog experiments show 86% success. Is that sufficient?" "It is better than 0%, Pasteur replied. "And we have no other option." Vulpian closed the notebook. "I agree the treatment should be attempted, but you understand, Monsieur Pasteur, that if this fails, the consequences for you personally will be severe." "I understand." The physicians agreed that the treatment should be attempted. Pasteur, despite decades of laboratory work, had never personally administered an injection. Grancher would do the actual vaccinations, but the decision, the responsibility, was Pasteur's. The first injection was given on July 6th. Joseph received the weakest viral preparation from spinal cord dried for 14 days. Pasteur watched, standing to the side of the hospital room, as Grancher administered the injection into the boy's abdomen. The procedure was quick, less than a minute. Joseph flinched, but did not cry out. "How do you feel?" Grancher asked. "It hurts a little," Joseph replied, "but not too much." Pasteur felt his own chest tighten with anxiety. The boy was so small, so vulnerable. What right did Pasteur have to gamble with this life? But the decision was made. The treatment had begun. Pasteur watched. The boy tolerated it well. No immediate reaction. Over the following days, progressively stronger preparations were injected. Joseph developed mild fevers but remained alert and active. He complained of soreness at the injection sites and occasional nausea, but nothing severe. Pasteur visited daily, ostensibly to monitor the treatment, but perhaps also to bear witness to his own decision. He would sit with Joseph and his mother, asking about symptoms, observing the boy's demeanor. Jean Meister, exhausted but hopeful, thanked him repeatedly. Pasteur found it difficult to accept her gratitude. Gratitude should come after success, not during uncertainty. On July 16th, the final injection was given, spinal cord dried for only 1 day, still highly virulent. This was the most dangerous dose. If the vaccine had not worked, If Joseph's immune system had not developed protection, this injection could itself cause rabies. Pasteur was present for this injection. He watched as Grancher prepared the syringe as the needle entered Joseph's skin as the viral material was injected into the boy's body. It was done. No way to reverse it now. They would wait and see if the boy lived or died. Pasteur waited. Days passed. Joseph remained healthy. A week? Still healthy. 2 weeks, no symptoms. The incubation period for rabies from a bite wound was typically 4 to 8 weeks. If Joseph remained healthy for 2 months, he would almost certainly survive. The waiting was exquisite torture. Pasteur developed a routine that bordered on obsessive. Each morning, he would send a messenger to the hospital for news of Joseph's condition. Each evening, he would visit the boy personally, observing him with the same intensity he brought to examining bacteria under a microscope. Was Joseph's color good? His appetite normal? Any sign of fever, headache, irritability, the early symptoms that might presage the onset of rabies? Joseph, for his part, seemed remarkably unaffected by the weight of expectation surrounding him. He was a child recovering from dog bites. The wounds healed normally. He played with toys his mother brought. He grew restless being confined to the hospital room and asked when he could go home. He had no conception that he was the subject of perhaps the most important medical experiment in history, that scientists across Europe were following news of his recovery, that his survival or death would determine whether humanity gained a powerful weapon against one of its oldest terrors. Joseph Meister understood. She watched her son with a mixture of hope and dread that made sleep impossible. She prayed constantly, rosary beads worn smooth from handling. When Pasteur visited, she would search his face for signs of optimism or concern, trying to read in his expression what he might not say aloud. Pasteur, for his part, maintained a careful neutrality. He would examine Joseph, ask questions, take notes, and offer only the most cautious assessments. He continues, well, we must wait longer to be certain. 3 weeks after the final injection, Joseph developed a mild fever. Pasteur received the news at his laboratory and felt his chest constrict with fear. This could be nothing, a common childhood ailment unrelated to rabies. Or it could be the beginning of the end, the virus finally reaching Joseph's brain, the vaccination having failed. He rushed to the hospital. Grancher was already there, examining the boy. 38 degrees, Grancher said, reading the thermometer. Slight elevation, no other symptoms. Headache? Pasteur asked Joseph. A little, the boy admitted. Confusion? Difficulty swallowing? No, monsieur, just tired. They waited. The fever persisted for 2 days, never rising above 38.5 degrees. Then it broke. Joseph's temperature returned to normal. His appetite came back. The headache disappeared. It had been nothing, perhaps a cold, perhaps the body's normal response to the vaccines still working through his system. But those 2 days aged Pasteur visibly. His assistants noticed that his hand trembled when he held instruments. He snapped at minor mistakes. He would start to speak and then forget what he had intended to say, his mind clearly elsewhere. Émile Roux took him aside one evening. You must rest. This anxiety is consuming you. I cannot rest, Pasteur replied. Not until we know. Even if the worst happens, it will not be your fault. The boy was dying anyway. If the worst happens, Pasteur said quietly, I will have killed him. There is a difference between dying of disease and dying of treatment. That difference will matter. Émile. To the boy's mother, to the law, to history, Roux had no answer for that. Pasteur was right. The moral and legal distinction between allowing a patient to die untreated and causing their death through failed treatment was real, even if the outcome was the same. Pasteur could barely sleep. He had taken an enormous risk, not just with Joseph's life, but with his own reputation and legal status. If the boy died, Pasteur could be prosecuted for practicing medicine without a license, potentially for manslaughter. The newspapers were already following the case. Success would make him immortal. Failure would destroy him. The press attention intensified as August turned to September. Journalists camped outside the hospital, trying to interview Joseph Meister, questioning doctors, seeking any scrap of information about the famous experiment. Headlines tracked Joseph's progress. Boy bitten by mad dog still lives. Pasteur's rabies. Treatment shows promise. World watches as science battles death. The attention was both validating and terrifying. It meant that everyone would be watching if Joseph died. He returned to his laboratory but could not concentrate. He would start experiments and then abandon them, distracted by thoughts of the boy in the hospital bed. His notebooks from this period show uncharacteristic disorder, crossed-out entries, incomplete calculations, questions without answers. He wrote letters to Marie, who had remained in Paris with him during this period, describing his anxiety in terms he rarely used. "I fear I have made a terrible mistake. If the boy dies, I will never forgive myself." Marie's response, preserved in their correspondence, was characteristic. "You made the only decision possible. The rest is in God's hands." But Pasteur had never been entirely comfortable leaving outcomes to God. His entire career had been built on the premise that human knowledge and action could change what seemed like natural inevitabilities. He had proved that fermentation was not spontaneous, but controlled by organisms. He had proved that disease was not divine punishment, but microbial infection. Now he was trying to prove that rabies, the most terrifying of diseases, could be prevented by human intervention. But the proof required Joseph Meister to live, and Pasteur had no control over that outcome beyond what he had already done. 6 weeks after the first injection, 7 weeks, 8 weeks, Joseph remained healthy, active, showing no signs of rabies. The critical period was passing. The virus, if it had survived the vaccination, should have reached his brain by now. The symptoms should have started, but they had not. On September 20, 1885, more than 2 months after the first injection, it was clear Joseph Meister had survived. He showed no signs of rabies. The vaccine had worked. The formal announcement was made at a meeting of the Academy of Sciences on October 26, 1885. Pasteur presented his data. The dog experiments, the protocol of graduated viral doses, and most importantly, the outcome for Joseph Meister. The assembled scientists listened in silence as Pasteur, his voice hoarse with emotion and fatigue, described the boy's recovery. When he finished, the hall erupted in applause. Scientists who had been skeptical of his rabies work, who had questioned whether vaccination could work against a virus that attacked the nervous system, were now convinced. The evidence was undeniable. Within hours, word spread beyond the Academy. By evening, newspapers across Paris were printing special editions announcing the breakthrough. "Rabies conquered by French science," declared Le Figaro. "Pasteur saves child from certain death," proclaimed Le Temps. The headlines were not hyperbole. For the first time in human history, someone bitten by a rabid animal had been saved through medical intervention. The news spread instantly across France and then across the world. Within days, Pasteur began receiving telegrams and letters from across Europe, from Russia, from the Americas. People bitten by rabid animals, or their desperate families, begged for treatment. Doctors asked for details of the protocol so they could attempt vaccination themselves. Scientists requested permission to visit Pasteur's laboratory to learn his methods. Pasteur received thousands of letters from people bitten by rabid animals, begging for the vaccine. The volume was overwhelming. Marie helped him sort the correspondence, prioritizing based on urgency, how recently the bite had occurred, how severe the injuries were, whether the attacking animal had been confirmed rabid. They could not help everyone. Treatment needed to begin within days of the bite before the virus traveled too far along the nerves toward the brain. Letters that arrived weeks after an attack brought news of suffering Pasteur could not prevent. He treated 19 more patients in 1885, working with Grancher and Roux to administer the vaccination series. The patients came from across France and from neighboring countries: a 6-year-old girl from Lyon, bitten by a wolf; a shepherd from the Pyrenees, attacked while protecting his flock; a teenager from Belgium who had tried to separate fighting dogs. Each case was a gamble, a test of whether the protocol that had saved Joseph Meister would work for others. The waiting between treatment and outcome was agonizing for each case. Pasteur kept meticulous records: the patient's age, the location and severity of bites, the time elapsed between attack and treatment, the course of vaccination, the result. 18 of the 19 survived, all but one survived, and that death was attributed to the treatment beginning too late. The patient, a middle-aged farmer, had been bitten weeks earlier and had delayed seeking help until symptoms had already begun. The virus had likely already reached the brain. The failure haunted Pasteur. Even though the delay had made success unlikely, even though the farmer would have died regardless, Pasteur reviewed his notes obsessively, wondering if a different protocol, stronger doses, more frequent injections, might have saved the man. He attended the funeral, something he rarely did for patients he had treated. The farmer's widow thanked him for trying. Pasteur could barely speak, but 18 successes out of 19 attempts was extraordinary. The statistical evidence was becoming overwhelming. The rabies vaccine worked. It was not perfect. Success required early treatment, proper dosing, patients healthy enough to mount an immune response. But it worked. Medicine had gained a new tool against one of humanity's most feared diseases. Pasteur became the most famous scientist in the world. By early 1886, his rabies treatment had saved more than 300 people. Patients traveled from across Europe to reach his laboratory in Paris. The French government, recognizing both the humanitarian importance and the prestige value of Pasteur's work, authorized the creation of a permanent research facility, the Pasteur Institute. The institute was to be funded by a combination of government support and private donations. Pasteur threw himself into fundraising with the same intensity he brought to research. He wrote letters to wealthy patrons, gave public lectures describing his work, and allowed journalists access to his laboratory to document the life-saving treatments being administered. The strategy worked. Donations poured in from France, from Europe, from Russia, from Brazil, from as far away as the United States. The Tsar of Russia contributed 100,000 francs after learning that Russian peasants bitten by wolves were traveling to Paris for treatment. The Ottoman Empire sent a delegation and a substantial donation after Pasteur successfully treated 19 Russians who had been attacked by a rabid wolf. They arrived together, a group of terrified peasants who spoke no French, accompanied by a translator and a Russian doctor who had heard of Pasteur's success. 18 of the 19 survived. The story made headlines across Europe and Asia. By 1887, more than 2 million francs had been raised. Construction began on a purpose-built facility in the 15th arrondissement of Paris. Pasteur insisted on a design that would facilitate research, laboratories with abundant natural light, separate rooms for different stages of vaccine preparation, animal facilities for experimental work, a clinic where patients could be treated and observed. He wanted the building to represent the future of medicine, clean, organized, dedicated to the systematic conquest of disease. By 1888, the Institute opened its doors in Paris, a gleaming modern facility where Pasteur and his collaborators could continue developing vaccines and training the next generation of microbiologists. The building was 4 stories of white stone, with large windows and a grand entrance hall. A chapel was included in the design. Pasteur's Catholicism remained an important part of his identity, and he wanted a place for prayer and reflection within the institute. And beneath the chapel, a crypt was prepared where Pasteur would eventually be entombed. The opening ceremony was a grand affair held on November 14, 1888. The President of France, Sadi Carnot, attended, along with ministers, scientists, foreign dignitaries, and hundreds of guests. The event was as much political theatre as scientific celebration. France, still smarting from its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, was eager to demonstrate its continued leadership in at least one domain. Pasteur, the patriot who had returned his German honours, the genius who had saved French industries and now French lives, was the perfect symbol. Speeches celebrated Pasteur as a national hero, a symbol of French scientific achievement. Joseph Lister, the British surgeon who had applied Pasteur's germ theory to develop antiseptic surgery, sent a message read aloud at the ceremony. Pasteur's discoveries have saved more lives than were lost in all the wars of our century. Pasteur himself gave a brief address, his speech halting slightly from the lingering effects of his strokes, but his message clear. He stood at the podium, leaning heavily on his cane, and spoke in a voice that was quiet but firm. The institute that opens today will be dedicated to the prevention of disease through scientific understanding. We will continue the work begun here, developing vaccines, training researchers, pursuing the invisible enemies that threaten human health. This work will serve not France alone, but humanity. Disease recognizes no borders. Neither should science. The audience rose in a standing ovation. Pasteur, exhausted, sat down quickly. The ceremony continued with tours of the facilities, demonstrations of vaccine preparation, presentations by Roux and other collaborators. But the emotional center had been Pasteur's brief speech, delivered by a partially paralyzed man in his 60s who had transformed medicine through sheer determination and intellect. The Pasteur Institute would become one of the most important research centers in the world. In the decades following its opening, researchers there would develop vaccines for diphtheria, tetanus, tuberculosis, polio, and yellow fever. They would discover the viruses causing hepatitis and HIV. They would train thousands of microbiologists who would carry the methods of scientific medicine across the globe. 8 Pasteur Institute scientists would win Nobel Prizes. The work continues today, more than a century later, still guided by the principles Pasteur established: careful observation, rigorous experimentation, and the belief that knowledge of disease causation can lead to disease prevention. But the rabies vaccine's success obscured ethical questions that would only become clear later. How thoroughly had Pasteur tested the vaccine before using it on Joseph Meister? His laboratory notebook suggests the dog experiments were less conclusive than he publicly claimed. Some vaccinated dogs still died when exposed to rabies. The success rate was high but not certain. Did Pasteur adequately inform Joseph Meister's mother of the risks? The historical record is unclear. She was desperate. Her son was doomed without treatment. Would she have refused if told the vaccine might itself cause rabies? Probably not. But the question of informed consent, still decades from becoming a formal ethical requirement in medicine, hangs over the case. And how many early rabies vaccination failures went unreported or were attributed to other causes? Pasteur's notebooks contain gaps and inconsistencies. Some patients treated in 1885 and 1886 simply disappear from the records. Did they die? Were their deaths recorded as occurring from other causes to avoid scandal? We do not know for certain. What we do know is that Pasteur was willing to take risks that a more cautious scientist would not have taken. He was willing to move from animal experiments to human trials without the extensive testing that modern medical ethics would require. He was willing to gamble a child's life on incomplete data because the alternative was certain death. This willingness to act decisively in the face of uncertainty was both Pasteur's greatest strength and his most troubling characteristic. It made him a hero. It also made him dangerous. After the rabies vaccine success, Pasteur's health continued to deteriorate. The 1868 stroke had permanently damaged him. In 1887, he suffered another stroke, then another. Each one left him weaker, less able to work in the laboratory. By 1890, he was largely confined to administrative work at the Pasteur Institute, directing research but no longer conducting experiments himself. The second stroke occurred during a meeting of the Academy of Sciences. Pasteur was presenting results from recent rabies vaccination cases when suddenly he lost his balance, grabbing the podium for support. His speech became slurred. Colleagues helped him to a chair. A doctor was summoned. The diagnosis, another cerebral hemorrhage, milder than the first, but compounding the existing damage. Recovery from this stroke was slower. Pasteur spent weeks at home, frustrated by his increasing physical limitations. He could still think, could still read and analyze data, but the physical work of the laboratory was becoming impossible. His left side was now almost completely paralyzed. Walking required a cane and assistance. Writing was difficult. His right hand still functioned but tired quickly. Émile Roux took over much of the hands-on work on rabies and diphtheria. Roux would eventually develop the diphtheria antitoxin, one of the first effective treatments for a bacterial disease, using principles he had learned working with Pasteur. But the credit for creating the research environment that made this possible belonged to Pasteur, and Roux never denied it. Pasteur spent his final years in a country house at Marnes-la-Coquette, near Paris. The move from the city was partly for health. His doctors recommended clean air and quiet, and partly practical. The constant stream of visitors seeking his advice, requesting consultations, or simply hoping to meet the famous scientist had made normal life in Paris impossible. At Marnes-la-Coquette, there was distance, space, the possibility of rest. He was surrounded by family, Marie, his son Jean-Baptiste, his surviving daughter Marie-Louise, grandchildren. The grandchildren were a particular joy in his declining years. He had not been an attentive father. His work had consumed him during his children's youth, but as a grandfather, with time forced upon him by physical limitation, he discovered a tenderness he had rarely shown his own children. He would sit with his grandchildren in the garden, telling them stories about his discoveries, translating complex science into simple narratives a child could understand. "Everything you see is made of tiny things too small to see," he would explain. "And some of those tiny things can make you sick, but if we understand them, we can stop them." Visitors came regularly, scientists seeking advice, government officials requesting his opinion, journalists wanting interviews. Pasteur received them in his study, a book-lined room dominated by a large desk, where he spent his mornings reading and dictating correspondence. Marie managed the schedule carefully, ensuring that visitors did not exhaust him. An hour in the morning, perhaps another in the late afternoon, more than that, and Pasteur would become confused, his speech slurring, fatigue overwhelming him. The house was comfortable, but not grand. Pasteur had refused offers to purchase an estate befitting France's most celebrated scientist. "I am a tanner's son," he told Marie, when she suggested they might consider a larger property. "I have achieved more than I ever imagined, but I will not pretend to be what I am not." The house at Marne-la-Coquette was bourgeois, respectable, unpretentious, the home of a successful professor, not an aristocrat. Large windows overlooked a garden where Pasteur would sit in the afternoons, reading or simply watching the light change. He had never been particularly interested in nature for its own sake. His focus had always been on the invisible world of microorganisms. But in his final years, he seemed to take quiet pleasure in the visible world: trees, flowers, the movements of birds and insects. Marie would later say that watching him in those moments, she saw a peace that had eluded him during his working years. The driven man who could not rest, who worked through illness and grief, had finally learned to be still. But stillness did not mean intellectual retirement. He remained intellectually active despite physical frailty. He attended academy sessions when he could, transported by carriage, assisted upstairs by Jean-Baptiste. The journey to Paris exhausted him. The jostling of the carriage aggravated his paralyzed side. The crowds and noise overwhelmed him, but he insisted on maintaining the connection. The academy was where his career had been made, where his discoveries had been announced, where he had fought and won so many scientific battles. He would not abandon it while he still lived. He read scientific journals voraciously, marking interesting articles with notes in the margins, dictating letters to Marie commenting on recent discoveries. When younger researchers published work that built on his foundations, he would write to congratulate them, sometimes offering suggestions or critiques. When he saw work that he believed was flawed or overstated, he would write stern letters to editors defending scientific rigor with the same intensity he had brought to his own research. Age and illness had weakened his body, but not his commitment to careful science. He dictated letters and papers, though his productivity was a fraction of what it had been. The ideas still came, connections between disparate observations, hypotheses about disease transmission, suggestions for experimental protocols, but he lacked the physical capacity to pursue them. That frustration was perhaps the hardest aspect of aging for Pasteur. His mind remained sharp, but his body had betrayed him, leaving him dependent on others to carry out work he could only imagine. But increasingly, he was becoming a symbol rather than a scientist, the embodiment of French scientific achievement, the man who had proved that disease could be conquered through knowledge and method. Newspapers marked his birthdays with commemorative articles, schools named classrooms after him, his portrait hung in government buildings. When the President of France visited Marne-la-Coquette in 1892 to award Pasteur yet another honor, Pasteur accepted with his characteristic combination of pride and discomfort. He was grateful for recognition, but uneasy with celebrity. "I am a scientist," he told the president. Recognition should go to the work, not the man. Yet the man and the work had become inseparable in the public imagination. Pasteur was France's answer to its military humiliations, proof that French genius could still lead the world. When he appeared in public, crowds gathered. When he spoke, people listened in respectful silence. He had become, in his own lifetime, a monument, celebrated, honored, and in some ways already entombed in the amber of national mythology even before his death. On September 28, 1895, at the age of 72, Pasteur died of complications from multiple strokes. His last words, spoken to Marie, were reportedly, "I cannot," when she offered him a glass of milk. A final assertion of control, even over something as simple as drinking. The death was not sudden. Pasteur had been declining for days, slipping in and out of consciousness. Marie stayed with him constantly, as she had stayed with him through 56 years of marriage, through the deaths of 3 daughters, through his strokes and recovery, through his triumphs and controversies. When he died, she was holding his hand as she had held Jean's hand decades earlier, as she had learned to hold on to what could be held even as so much slipped away. The French government organized a state funeral. Thousands attended, lining the streets as the funeral procession moved through Paris. The President of the Republic delivered the eulogy, describing Pasteur as one of the greatest Frenchmen who had ever lived, a man who had brought honor to France through his scientific achievements. Pasteur was buried in a crypt beneath the Pasteur Institute, entombed in a chapel decorated with mosaics depicting his major discoveries: crystallography, fermentation, silkworm disease, anthrax, rabies. The mythology began immediately. Newspapers described him as the selfless scientist who had devoted his life to humanity, who had saved countless millions through his discoveries, who had never sought personal glory or financial gain. This narrative was partly true. Pasteur had refused to patent his vaccines, believing that medical knowledge should be freely available. But it was also incomplete. The complete picture of Pasteur, which would only emerge decades later when his laboratory notebooks were opened to scholars in 1964, is more complex. He was brilliant, driven, and capable of extraordinary insight. He was also fiercely competitive, willing to manipulate data to support his claims, reluctant to share credit, and sometimes reckless in the risks he took with human subjects. The germ theory of disease, which Pasteur helped establish, transformed medicine completely. Before Pasteur, physicians treated symptoms without understanding causes. After Pasteur, medicine became etiological, focused on identifying and attacking the specific organisms that cause disease. This shift made modern medicine possible: antiseptic surgery, sanitation reforms, water treatment, food safety regulations, vaccination programs. All of these emerged from the recognition that invisible microorganisms cause disease and could be controlled. The lives saved by this transformation number in the hundreds of millions. Typhoid, cholera, diphtheria, rabies, anthrax, diseases that killed indiscriminately throughout human history, became preventable. The child mortality rate, which had remained essentially constant for millennia, began to plummet in the late 19th century and continued declining throughout the 20th. Life expectancy in developed countries doubled from approximately 40 years in 1850 to 80 years by 2000. Much of that gain resulted directly from understanding and controlling infectious diseases, the work that Pasteur pioneered. Pasteur did not accomplish this alone. Robert Koch in Germany, Joseph Lister in Britain, Ignaz Semmelweis in Austria, Émile Roux in France, all contributed essential pieces. But Pasteur's work was foundational, and his genius for public demonstration and communication made the ideas accessible and compelling to both scientists and the general public. Yet the ethical questions raised by his methods remain relevant. When is it acceptable to take risks with human subjects? How much testing is enough before moving from animals to humans? How should scientists balance the urgency of saving lives against the need for caution and thoroughness? Modern medical ethics, codified in documents like the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki, emerged partly in response to researchers who, like Pasteur, believed that the ends justified the means, that saving future lives justified risks to present patients. These codes now require informed consent, extensive animal testing before human trials, independent ethical review, and documented protocols that cannot be altered without approval. Pasteur would have found these requirements frustrating, perhaps impossible to work within, but they exist because of cases like his, where the boundary between heroic medicine and human experimentation became unclear. The tension between scientific ambition and human safety that characterized Pasteur's career remains unresolved. During the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccine development moved forward at unprecedented speed, compressing timelines that normally required years into months. This urgency saved millions of lives. It also generated controversy about whether adequate testing had been completed, whether the vaccines were being deployed before their safety was fully established. The ghost of Louis Pasteur hovers over these debates, the scientist willing to act on incomplete data because waiting would mean more deaths. Pasteur's relationship with his collaborators also raises questions about how credit is assigned in science. The myth of the lone genius, the individual who single-handedly makes world-changing discoveries, was largely created by figures like Pasteur, who actively promoted this image. The reality is that scientific progress is almost always collaborative. Émile Roux, Charles Chamberlain, Émile Duclos, and many others contributed essential work to the discoveries attributed to Pasteur, yet their names are largely forgotten outside of specialist histories, while Pasteur's is immortalized. This is partly Pasteur's fault. He was a difficult collaborator, quick to claim credit and slow to acknowledge contributions. But it is also a function of how societies choose to remember science, through individual heroes rather than collaborative teams. The Pasteur Institute itself, named for one man, represents the work of hundreds. Every vaccine developed there, every disease prevented, every life saved, is the product of collective effort. Yet we remember Pasteur. The French national mythology around Pasteur is particularly interesting. He became a symbol of French scientific and cultural superiority at a time when France was struggling to compete with Germany's rising industrial and military power. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 had been a humiliation. France defeated in months, forced to cede Alsace-Lorraine, occupied by German troops who paraded through Paris. Pasteur's scientific victories over German scientists like Robert Koch became a form of symbolic revenge. When Pasteur returned his honorary degree from the University of Bonn after the war, declaring he could not accept honors from a country that had invaded France, it was a gesture of nationalism as much as principle. This nationalism shaped how Pasteur's work was promoted and celebrated. The Pasteur Institute became not just a research facility, but a monument to French genius. Pasteur's funeral was a state occasion, partly because his death was seen as a national loss. The mythology served political purposes, demonstrating that France remained a world leader in at least one domain, even if its military and industrial power had been eclipsed. But mythology always simplifies. The real Louis Pasteur was more interesting than the saint in the stained glass mosaics. He was a man shaped by specific circumstances, the son of a tanner who climbed into the elite through education and obsessive work, who suffered personal tragedies that redirected his research toward disease, who made genuine breakthroughs but also cut corners and manipulated data when it served his purposes, who took risks that no modern researcher could take, who changed the world but also hurt people along the way. Understanding this complex reality does not diminish Pasteur's achievements. If anything, it makes them more impressive. The germ theory of disease was not inevitable. Many scientists had observed microorganisms without making the conceptual leap to disease causation. Many had conducted experiments on fermentation without recognizing its broader implications. Pasteur's genius lay in his ability to connect observations across different domains, crystallography, fermentation, disease, and to design experiments that definitively proved connections that others only suspected. His willingness to engage in public demonstrations, to stake his reputation on specific predictions, to communicate his findings beyond specialist journals, these were not peripheral to his success, but central to it. Science does not change the world through discovery alone. It changes the world when discoveries are communicated, applied, and integrated into institutions and practices. Pasteur understood this intuitively. The demonstration at Pouilly-le-Fort, the treatment of Joseph Meister, the founding of the Pasteur Institute, these were acts of communication as much as acts of science, translating laboratory results into public understanding and institutional support. The moment that encapsulates both Pasteur's genius and his ethical complexity is that first injection of rabies vaccine into Joseph Meister. It was an act of either heroic medicine or reckless experimentation, depending on how you frame it. It was both. And that duality, the inseparability of progress and risk, of breakthrough and gamble, defines much of modern medicine. Joseph Meister, the boy whose survival made Pasteur immortal, became the gatekeeper of the Pasteur Institute, living and working there for decades. After his recovery in 1885, Meister returned to Alsace with his mother, resuming a normal childhood. But he never forgot what Pasteur had done for him. In 1895, when Pasteur died, Meister attended the funeral. Afterward, he sought employment at the Institute and was hired as a caretaker. For 45 years he maintained the building and grounds, a living symbol of Pasteur's greatest achievement. He survived Pasteur by 45 years. In 1940, during the Nazi occupation of Paris, German soldiers demanded access to Pasteur's crypt. Meister, then 64 years old, refused. When the soldiers threatened to force entry, Meister shot himself. He was buried near Pasteur in the Institute cemetery. This ending, the boy saved by Pasteur's vaccine choosing death rather than allowing the desecration of Pasteur's tomb, has a mythological quality that obscures its human tragedy. Meister's suicide was not a noble sacrifice but a complex act shaped by war, occupation, age, and a lifetime of being defined by a single moment in childhood. He had lived his entire adult life in Pasteur's shadow, his identity permanently fixed as the first person saved by the rabies vaccine. When faced with the possibility of failing to protect Pasteur's memory, perhaps he felt that his life's purpose would be invalidated. Or perhaps at 64, facing the uncertainty and fear of occupation, he simply reached a breaking point that had nothing to do with Pasteur at all. Yet there is also something fitting about the connection. Meister's life was saved by a scientist willing to take extraordinary risks. Meister died protecting that scientist's memory. Both acts, Pasteur's decision to vaccinate, Meister's decision to die, involved gambling individual lives for larger principles. Both were shaped by contexts, scientific ambition, nationalist pride that made certain choices possible and others impossible. The legacy of Louis Pasteur is not a simple story of progress. It is a story about what progress costs, about who pays the price, about the distance between myth and reality. Every time a parent vaccinates their child, every time a surgeon sterilizes instruments, every time milk is pasteurized, Pasteur's ideas are present. But so are the questions. How much do we test before we act? Who decides what risks are acceptable? How do we balance urgency against caution? These questions have no final answers. They must be confronted anew in each generation, in each crisis, by each researcher facing the gap between what they know and what they need to know to save lives. Louis Pasteur confronted them in the most direct way possible by injecting an untested vaccine into a 9-year-old boy and watching to see if the boy would live or die. The boy lived. Millions of others have lived because of what Pasteur discovered, but the cost of those discoveries, the ethical compromises, the human experiments, the manipulated data, the denied credit, remains part of the story, not as a cancellation of achievement, but as a complication of it. Pasteur died believing he had conquered disease. He had not. Disease remains, new pathogens emerge, old ones evolve resistance, epidemics still kill millions. But he had demonstrated that disease could be fought with knowledge, that invisible enemies could be made visible, that the trajectory of death could be altered through human action. That demonstration, more than any specific discovery, is his enduring contribution. In the crypt beneath the Pasteur Institute, surrounded by mosaics depicting his triumphs, Louis Pasteur lies entombed. The mosaics are beautiful, stylized representations of his work. The swan neck flasks proving life comes from life. The anthrax-infected sheep at Pouilly-le-Fort. The rabies vaccine saving Joseph Meister. They depict a narrative of unambiguous heroism, of science conquering disease through genius and dedication. Above him, researchers continue the work he began, developing vaccines, studying pathogens, fighting diseases that still kill millions. The institute he founded has trained generations of microbiologists, has developed treatments for tuberculosis and polio and AIDS, has contributed to every major advance in infectious disease control for over a century. The work is unfinished. It will always be unfinished, but it continues because one man, grieving his dead daughters, decided that understanding how microorganisms killed might allow him to stop them from killing. He was right. The cost of proving it was higher than he ever publicly admitted. The benefit has been beyond calculation. That is the final complexity of Louis Pasteur. He saved more lives than any conqueror or king, and he did it through methods that would now be considered ethically unacceptable. Both statements are true, neither cancels the other. History does not offer us pure heroes. It offers us complicated humans who changed the world in complicated ways. The rabies vaccine worked. Joseph Meister lived. Millions of others lived. And Louis Pasteur, the tanner's son who could not tolerate Paris at 15, who received a mediocre grade in chemistry at 17, who watched 3 daughters die of diseases he could not prevent, transformed himself into the man who taught humanity how to fight back against invisible killers. He succeeded, but success is not the same as innocence, and recognizing the difference, understanding both what Pasteur achieved and what it cost, is the only way to honestly reckon with his legacy. The man in the crypt is not the saint in the mosaics. He is something more complex, more human, and ultimately more instructive. A genius who took terrible risks. A father who could not save his own children, but saved millions of others. A scientist who manipulated data in service of truths that were ultimately true. Louis Pasteur died certain of his immortality. He was right about that too. But immortality is not the same as perfection. It is simply permanence, the refusal to be forgotten, the insistence that what was discovered must be remembered, along with how it was discovered and what it cost to discover it. In that accounting, Pasteur endures not as a myth, but as a mirror, reflecting both the possibilities and the dangers of human ambition applied to the conquest of nature. We live in the world he helped create. We still face the questions he could not answer. And that is precisely why his story, more than a century after his death, remains urgent and alive.